He opened the door and said she was free to leave. By dark, she was back on his porch. Neither of them said a word about it. Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1868, was a hard young country still settling its accounts from a war fought 1,000 miles east, and among the debts that war had left unsettled in its wake was a practice the territory's better citizens preferred not to examine too closely: the quiet auctioning off, in half-legal courthouse yards and backroom arrangements, of bonded debtors and their kin, sold to work off obligations that had, more often than not, outlived any honest measure of what was truly owed. It was at one such auction, in the dusty yard behind the Prescott Courthouse, held beneath a hard, bright sky that seemed, to more than one uneasy onlooker, entirely too pleasant a morning for the business being conducted beneath it, that Wyatt Devereaux came that gray dawn with money he could not spare and a need he could not otherwise fill, and left, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, the reluctant owner of a bonded woman's contract he had bought for $11 and a debt of shame he would carry a good deal longer than the money. Wyatt was 28, a rancher 2 months widowed, his wife Sarah dead in childbed with their daughter's difficult birth, the grief of it still raw enough that he could not yet pass the small room they had prepared together for the baby without his chest going tight and airless. The infant girl who had survived her mother now cried through every night on his own 400 acres, with no woman on the place to nurse her or soothe her, and no hired help he could afford beyond the 2 hands who already worked his cattle from dawn to dark, both of them decent men but entirely helpless before a colicking newborn's grief-worn father. He had heard, from a neighbor's careless mention, that the courthouse auction that week included a woman skilled in household work, and children both. Her own family's debts sold down to her after her father's death left the obligation with no one else to answer it, and Wyatt had gone, sick with the wrongness of the whole business, and bid the $11 because his daughter's crying had grown desperate enough to make a decent man do an indecent thing. He had not looked at the woman's face while the auctioneer read the terms of her bond. He had looked at his own boots and paid the sum and signed the paper and led her out of that dusty yard toward his wagon without a word, ashamed of himself in a way he could not yet fully name. It was not until they had ridden a mile in silence that Wyatt Devereaux made himself look at her properly, and found a woman of 25, dark-eyed and composed despite the whole indignity of the morning, sitting straight-backed on the wagon seat with her hands folded and her face carefully, deliberately blank in the particular way of someone who has learned that showing fear only ever invited more of what caused it. "Your name," Wyatt said, gruff, because he did not know how else to begin. "Soledad Vega," she said. "My father owed a debt to Mr. Draycott, the broker who ran this morning's auction, for a loan taken against our small holding 2 years back. My father died last winter of a fever, and Mr. Draycott informed me the debt did not die with him, and that I would work it off in his stead in whatever household purchased my bond." Her voice was steady, though something beneath the steadiness told Wyatt plainly what the steadiness was costing her. "I do not know what work you require of me, Mr. Devereaux. I am told I am a fair cook and a fair hand with children. I hope that answers whatever purpose brought you to that yard this morning." Wyatt Devereaux drove the rest of the way to his own ranch in a silence that grew heavier with every mile, and it was not until they reached his gate and he had helped her down from the wagon and led her inside to where his daughter lay crying in her cradle that he finally said the thing he had been working up the courage to say the whole ride home. "I am not going to own a person, Miss Vega," Wyatt said, standing in his own kitchen with his hat in his hands. I do not know what made me think I could walk into that yard and bid on another human soul and call it anything but what it plainly was. I have paper here and pen, and I mean to write out your manumission this evening, plain and proper, releasing you from whatever bond Draycott claims to hold, and you may go wherever you please by nightfall, with my apology for ever having been part of the business at all." Soledad Vega looked at him a long moment, and something in her carefully blank composure flickered, uncertain whether to trust the offer. "You bought my bond an hour ago, Mr. Devereaux," she said slowly. "Men do not generally free what they have just paid for." "This one does," Wyatt said, and sat down at his own kitchen table and wrote out, in his own plain rough hand, a full and unconditional release of any claim upon Soledad Vega's person or labor, and signed it, and pressed it into her hands before his own courage could fail him. "That paper is yours to keep, and yours to show any man who questions it. You are free, Miss Vega. I am sorry it took a paper and not simple decency to make it so this morning, but it is done now, and I will not trouble you further." He expected her to go. He told himself, watching her fold the paper carefully and tuck it into her sleeve, that he had done the only right thing left available to him, and that whatever became of her now was no longer his to worry over. She was gone from the house within the hour, walking the dusty road toward town with nothing but the paper in her sleeve and whatever small bundle of belongings the auction had left her, a single worn shawl, and a tin cup tied at her waist, and Wyatt Devereaux spent the rest of that long day tending his crying daughter alone, pacing the small house with the infant against his shoulder, and the silence pressing in on him worse than any noise could have, telling himself he had done right, and finding the telling considerably less comforting than he had hoped. By dusk, Soledad Vega was back on his porch. Wyatt opened the door to a soft knock, and found her standing there in the fading light, the manumission paper still visible at her sleeve, her composure worn thinner now than it had been that morning, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "I walked to town," Soledad said finally, "and found Mr. Draycott had already spread word among every respectable household that I was his bonded debtor absconded, whatever paper I carried, and that any decent family taking me in would answer to him for it. I have no family left in this territory, Mr. Devereaux, no money beyond what small coin I carried, and a broker with considerable local influence determined to see me return to his account one way or another. I did not come back because I doubted your paper. I came back because the world beyond your gate proved, within a single afternoon, a good deal more dangerous to a woman alone than the man who had just freed her." She lifted her chin, some of the old composure returning by force of will. "I am not asking to stay as your bonded servant, Mr. Devereaux. That paper says I owe you nothing. I am asking whether a free woman might trade honest work for honest wages and a roof, the same arrangement any hired hand might make, until I have coin enough to make my own way properly." Wyatt Devereaux stood in his own doorway with his daughter crying softly behind him in her cradle, and looked at the woman he had freed that morning and who had, by evening, walked back to the one door in the territory that had ever treated her plainly, and found himself, for reasons he did not yet examine too closely, considerably relieved by her return. Wyatt stood a long moment considering her, weighing the plain sense of her request against the whole tangle of feeling the morning had already stirred in him, guilt, and something warmer he did not yet have a name for, and a genuine practical need he could not deny, since his daughter's crying had not once stopped its ragged, exhausted rhythm the whole afternoon he had spent alone with her. "There's a fair wage in it, and your own room, and no man on this place will trouble you," Wyatt said. That's the whole of what I can offer, plain and honest. Come in out of the evening chill, Miss Vega, before that paper in your sleeve gets rained on, and we have to write you a second one." She almost smiled at that, the first real easing he had seen in her whole guarded face since the auction yard, and stepped past him into the warm lamplight of his kitchen, and Wyatt understood, watching her go straight to the crying cradle without being asked, exactly how much his household had been missing that he had not yet had the words to name. And that was the whole of the arrangement neither of them fully named that first evening. A quiet negotiation between two people who each, in their own way, had learned that asking plainly for what they wanted rarely ended well, and who found, in the weeks that followed, that the negotiation had a way of shifting into something neither had quite bargained for. The days that followed built into something Wyatt Devereaux had no name for, and had stopped believing, in the raw grief of 2 widowed months, was owed to a man like him. Soledad ran his household with a quiet, thorough competence that eased the whole raw exhaustion of his grief by slow degrees. The accounts he had let slide since Sarah's death found their way back into order within a fortnight. The neglected garden began, under her patient hand, to yield something other than weeds, and the whole low house seemed, by small, unremarked degrees, to breathe easier for her presence in it. More than that, she took to his infant daughter with a tenderness that undid him every time he watched it, walking the baby through her worst crying spells with a low humming song in Spanish that Wyatt did not understand and found, regardless, the most peaceful sound his house had known since Sarah's death. A melody he came, within weeks, to listen for each evening the way another man might listen for a church bell. He began, within the fortnight, finding reasons to linger in his own kitchen of an evening, rather than retreat to the barn the moment supper was cleared, and Soledad, for her part, began speaking more freely, as the weeks proved his decency was not merely a single morning's guilty gesture, but a settled, daily habit. "You never once asked what my life was," before the debt, Soledad said one such evening, rocking the baby by the low fire while Wyatt mended harness nearby. "Every man of standing I have met since my father's death asks it within the first quarter hour, generally with more curiosity about my misfortune than my person." "Didn't figure it was mine to ask," Wyatt said. "You'll tell it if you want telling, same as I'll tell you about Sarah when the telling doesn't feel like tearing something open again." He set down the harness a moment. "I lost my wife 2 months back watching our daughter be born, Miss Vega. I don't talk about it easy, and I don't expect you to talk about your own hard year easy either. Figured we'd get there in our own time, if we got there at all. My father was a good man and a poor gambler," Soledad said, after a long, quiet moment, the fire cracking low. "He believed every single time that the next hand would settle the last debt rather than deepen it. I loved him entirely and could not save him from himself, and when the fever took him last winter, I discovered the debt had grown large enough that Mr. Draycott considered my wholesale fair payment for it." Her hands stilled on the sleeping baby a moment, the memory plainly costing her something even in the telling. "I sat in that courthouse yard 3 days before the auction, Mr. Devereaux, listening to Draycott's clerk read out the terms to anyone who asked, and I taught myself, in those 3 days, to feel nothing at all while I waited, because feeling anything felt like a door I would not be able to close again once opened. I do not tell you this for pity. I tell you because you have shown me more plain decency in 3 weeks than most of the men in this territory manage in a lifetime. And I find I no longer wish to be a mystery to you." Wyatt was quiet a moment, turning the harness over in his hands without truly seeing it. Sarah used to say a person only tells the whole truth of themselves to somebody they've already decided is safe to tell it to, he said finally. I reckon that's a compliment, Miss Vega, whatever it cost you to pay it. I believe it was meant as one, Soledad said, and for the first time since her arrival, something in her voice carried the ghost of real warmth rather than careful composure alone. It was some weeks after that evening, on a warm night when the baby had finally settled early and the two of them found themselves alone on the porch in the cooling dark, that the careful distance they had both maintained nearly gave way entirely. Wyatt had brought out 2 cups of coffee, more out of habit than need, and sat down beside her rather than across from her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And for a long while neither of them spoke at all, the crickets loud in the dark, and the whole warm night pressing close around them. Sarah used to sit right here, Wyatt said finally, low, evenings, before the baby came. I haven't sat out here once since she died. Couldn't stand the emptiness of the second cup. He looked at Soledad in the dim light, close enough now that neither of them moved to widen the distance between them. I don't rightly know how to say what I mean without it sounding like I'm replacing something, which I swear to you I am not trying to do. You are not replacing anything, Wyatt, Soledad said, using his given name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice seemed to still something in him entirely. You are simply living, which is a different thing from forgetting, whatever the grief tries to tell you. His hand found hers on the porch boards between them, and neither of them drew back, and for one long suspended moment the whole warm dark held its breath around the half-inch that remained between them, close enough that he could feel her breath, close enough that it would have taken nothing at all to close the last of it. Neither of them did. Soledad, ever the more careful of the two, drew a slow breath and eased back first, though her hand stayed folded in his a moment longer than strict propriety required. Not yet, she said, quiet, not unkindly. I have been owned once in my life, Wyatt Devereaux, however briefly, and I find I want to choose the next closeness freely, in my own time, rather than let the loneliness of one evening decide it for both of us. Take whatever time you need, Wyatt said, and meant it entirely, and the two of them sat a good while longer in the dark, hands still loosely joined, saying nothing further at all, which was by then its own kind of understanding between them. Before the summer's heat settled fully over the territory, and it would, soon enough, the way Arizona summers always did, there was a stretch of careful, deepening weeks at the Devereaux ranch, a household slowly finding its footing between grief and something warmer neither party had yet named. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What happens next is the part that changes everything. And if tales of love that outlast the hardest country the West could offer are the kind that keep you company, the small bell beneath this story is how we go on meeting like this. Emmett Draycott came riding up the Devereaux lane on a hot July afternoon with 2 hired men behind him, and the whole easy piece of that careful summer collapsed in the space of a single dusty arrival. Devereaux, Draycott said, not troubling to dismount, a lean, sharp-eyed man whose prosperity showed plain in his good coat and his poor manners both. I've come for my property. That manumission you wrote wasn't worth the paper it scratched on, not without my own signature releasing the debt proper, and I never signed any such release. You bought a bond, not an outright purchase, and a bond's terms don't dissolve because one man decides his conscience is worth more than the paper he signed. I paid the sum the auctioneer named Draycott in full and fair, Wyatt said, coming out onto the porch with his own rifle close at hand, though he did not yet raise it. That paper's mine to write as I see fit, same as the bond was mine to purchase. The paper's worthless without my counter-signature, and every judge in this territory knows the custom. Whatever a rancher's guilty conscience wishes were true, Draycott said. I've a buyer waiting in Tucson paying triple what you gave me for a woman skilled as she's proven herself, and I mean to collect what's mine before the week is out. You can hand her over peaceable, Devereaux, or my men can persuade her otherwise, and I'd rather not trouble myself with the persuading if a reasonable man will simply do the sensible thing. It was Soledad herself, standing in the doorway behind Wyatt with the old manumission paper already drawn from her sleeve, who answered before Wyatt could. You will find, Mr. Draycott, that the territory's own recording office has held a properly witnessed copy of this release for the past 6 weeks, Soledad said, steady despite the danger plainly gathered in the yard before her. I walked it to the county clerk myself the very week Mr. Devereaux wrote it, and paid the filing fee from my own first wages, because I did not trust a broker's word regarding what paper would or would not hold up in a courthouse. You may ride to that same clerk's office and examine the record yourself, or you may continue standing in this yard making threats a filed document has already answered. Draycott's composure faltered, plainly unprepared for the possibility that a woman he had considered mere property had thought to protect her own freedom with the same careful thoroughness he had used to sell it. A filed paper doesn't change what's owed, he said, though the certainty had gone out of his voice. It changes precisely what a territorial judge will say when I lay before him both your original bond's terms, which named a specific and finite sum, and the receipt proving that sum has been more than repaid through 6 weeks of unclaimed wages Mr. Devereaux has kept accounted and set aside for me since the day I returned to his porch, Soledad said, and drew out, alongside the manumission paper, a small careful ledger of her own keeping. You did not merely lose a bonded debtor today, Mr. Draycott. You lost the argument the moment you decided a frightened, grieving woman would be too afraid to learn her own rights, and I find I was considerably less frightened than you hoped. The 2 hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles, one of them muttering something low to the other that Wyatt could not catch but read plainly enough in the man's suddenly reluctant posture. Draycott's 2 hired men, unnerved by the sight of a woman who plainly had the law rather than merely the sentiment on her side, exchanged an uncertain glance, and it was that small crack in his hired resolve, more than anything else, that decided the standoff, for men paid to intimidate a frightened woman into compliance had little stomach for dragging a legally free citizen off a rancher's own porch in broad daylight with a filed court record standing against them, and a rifle besides. I ain't hanging for kidnapping over $11 and a bad debt, Draycott, one of the hired men said finally, low but not quite low enough. You said this was a simple collection. Weren't nobody told me there'd be a filed court paper standing against it? Draycott's face went a dull, furious red at his own man's public doubt, and Wyatt watched the whole careful architecture of the broker's confidence collapse in the space of a single muttered sentence. This isn't finished, Devereaux, Draycott said, wheeling his horse. It is for today, Wyatt said, rifle still steady, and if you come back a second time, I'll see the territorial marshal hears the whole history of your debt peonage business, and let the law finish what your own nerve just couldn't. Draycott did not come a third time. Word reached the territory within the month that 2 other families he had once bonded through similarly dubious debts had come forward, emboldened by Soledad's own public stand, to challenge their own contracts, and Emmett Draycott's profitable business collapsed under the weight of a territorial investigation that ended, by autumn, in his own arrest for fraud. Wyatt Devereaux, watching Soledad Vega stand in his own doorway and dismantle a broker's threat with nothing but a filed paper and her own steady voice, understood, in that moment, precisely what kind of woman had walked back to his porch that first evening, and precisely how much he had come, without ever quite admitting it, to need her there. "You filed that paper without telling me," Wyatt said, once Draycott's dust had settled on the road. "I did not want you to think I stayed only because I trusted you, Wyatt," Soledad said. "I wanted to trust myself first. A woman who has been sold once learns to keep at least one door open only she can walk through, whatever kindness she is shown." She looked at him now, steady and certain in a way the porch darkness had not quite permitted weeks before. "I do not need rescuing today. I never did, not truly. Not since the day I wrote my own name onto a county record. But I find I would still like to stay, Wyatt Devereaux, not as a bonded woman, and not merely as a hired hand, if you are asking something warmer than wages." "I am asking exactly that," Wyatt said, and closed the distance the porch dark had once left open, and the kiss he gave her then, in the settling dust of a threat finally answered, was quiet and certain. And what broke open in Soledad was the plain astonishment of choosing, freely and entirely on her own terms, the very closeness she had once been sold without ever being asked. Draycott was arrested that autumn, once the territorial investigation had gathered sufficient testimony, and word of his trial drew considerable attention across the territory. For a peonage broker's fall from prosperity to prison made for exactly the kind of cautionary tale a young territory eager to distance itself from its own uglier practices was glad enough to tell loudly. He was sentenced to a decade's hard labor for fraud and unlawful bondage, and the two other families who had come forward with their own claims saw a measure of restitution paid from what remained of his seized fortune. A small late justice that Soledad, reading the news in the territorial paper, received with a quiet satisfaction she did not trouble to hide. They were married that autumn quietly at the ranch, with Wyatt's two hands standing witness and the baby, grown fat and settled, sleeping through the whole ceremony in a cradle Soledad had rocked her through 100 difficult nights. Soledad chose for the child's middle name, her own mother's name, a small quiet, honoring neither Wyatt nor his late wife's memory needed to compete with, for he had told her plainly, more than once, that he wanted his daughter raised knowing two mothers' worth of love rather than mourning the absence of one. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, Soledad's own careful management of the household accounts proving, in time, as valuable to Wyatt's modest fortunes as her tenderness had already proven to his daughter, and the two hands who had once watched their employer bring home a bonded stranger with visible unease came, within a single season, to regard Soledad Devereaux as the truest hand the ranch had ever kept. She kept the old manumission paper, worn soft now from months, folded in her sleeve, framed in their own front hall ever after, not as a wound to be remembered bitterly, but as the plain proof. She told her own daughter in later years that a person's worth was never truly for sale, whatever a broker's ledger claimed, and that the truest freedom a person could be given was the kind that let them choose, entirely on their own terms and in their own good time, exactly where they wished to walk back to. Wyatt, for his part, never once forgot the shame of that dawn auction yard, and kept it deliberately close rather than let time soften it into a comfortable story, because he had learned, watching Soledad build a whole free life out of the wreckage of a broker's ledger, that the plainest decency a man could practice was simply remembering, always, exactly what he had once very nearly done, and choosing, every single day after, to do better by it. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived not through rescue, but through a woman's own free choosing, then this story was for you. Out on the dry high country of Arizona, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, The love between Wyatt Devereaux and the woman who walked back to his door became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. He opened the door and set her free. She chose of her own will to walk back through it, and neither of them ever needed more words than that to know exactly what it meant. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, injustice, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.